Every spring, thousands of school children south of Seattle walk out of class in the middle of the morning and start climbing uphill, away from Mount Rainier. Not away from a fire, not away from an earthquake. This isn't a normal school drill. They're walking uphill, away from a volcano that the United States Geological Survey ranks as a bigger threat to American lives and property than Yellowstone. They follow a marked route through tow, then away from the river, and they keep going until they reach the highest ground they can get to on foot. It ran again just this past April, on the 23rd. Puyallup, Sumner, Bonnie Lake, Ording, White River, Carbonado, 5 school districts walking uphill on a Thursday morning. They go on foot for a specific reason. Ording has already tested the alternative, and the drills showed that putting students into vehicles does not work. The roads clog up and the time runs out. Here's the part I want you to sit with before going any further. There is no eruption happening. There's no alert in effect, no warning sounding. Nothing on that mountain right now that a geologist would call unrest. And yet, every spring, those kids still walk. They're not rehearsing for the thing you might be picturing. The ranking is worth being precise about because people assume it's exaggeration. In 2018, USGS scored every volcano in the United States, all 160 of them, using 15 hazard factors and 9 exposure factors. Yellowstone, the one everybody body names first, placed 21st with a threat score of 115. Mount Rainier placed 3rd with a score of 203. Only Kilauea and Mount St. Helens scored above it, 3rd in the entire country. And most people outside Washington state couldn't tell you the first thing about why. Here's what this mountain actually is, because the postcard version undersells the problem badly. Rainier is loaded with ice, roughly a cubic mile of it spread across 25 glaciers, and USGS's own fact sheet says that's as much ice as all the other Cascade R-Ang volcanoes carry combined. The ice is only half the problem. The rock underneath it is the other half. Magma sitting deep inside the volcano releases heat and gas, and that turns groundwater hot and acidic. Over long stretches of time, that acidic water eats through hard volcanic rock and converts it into weak, clay-rich rock. Geologists call this hydrothermal alteration. USGS describes what happens next in one sentence, and it's the single most important sentence in this whole story. When masses of water-saturated, clay-rich rock slide away, they transform rapidly into a lahar. The interior of Mount Rainier has been rotting from the inside for a very long time, and not evenly. The west flank carries the largest volume of that weakened rock, positioned high on the mountain, which is why USGS names the head of the Puyallup River as the most likely source of a far-traveled collapse. That brings us to the word lahar itself, and it needs to be understood properly because most people hear mudslide and picture something you could casually drive away from. Lahar is an Indonesian term geologists adopted worldwide. USGS defines it as a rapidly flowing slurry of mud and boulders that looks and behaves like flowing concrete, and it destroys or buries most man-made structures in its path. Past lahars off Mount Rainier have traveled at 45 to 50 miles per hour in the tight, confined valleys near the volcano, and where those valleys pinch them in, the deposits have stood 100 feet thick or more. Hold on to that speed figure, because it needs correcting once we get further from the mountain. Lava and ash are not the main threat here. USGS expects both to stay close to the summit or flow eastward, away from the bulk of the population. Lahars are the thing to actually worry about. USGS calls them the greatest threat Mount Rainier poses to people and property downstream. Now here's what this mountain has already done, because none of this is speculative. It's sitting in the soil under towns that exist today. About 5,600 years ago, 2 to 3 cubic kilometers of hydrothermally altered rock came off the summit of Rainier, picked up water as it traveled, ran 75 miles, and reached Puget Sound near Auburn. That's the Osceola mudflow, and it happened during a period of eruptions. Ording, Buckley, Sumner, those towns aren't near where it went. Those towns are built directly on top of the surface it left behind. An Osceola-scale event is rare, and there's no reason to pretend otherwise. Pierce County puts flows of that magnitude at far less frequent than once every 1,000 years. The event actually worth focusing on is smaller, much more recent, and considerably more unsettling. Around 500 years ago, a mass of that same weakened clay-rich rock came off the west flank near Sunset Amphitheater. The Lahar carried 260 million cubic meters of material more than 30 miles down the Puyallup Valley, straight through the section, now occupied by the town of Ording, and buried an old-growth forest standing exactly where Ording sits today. At Ording, the deposit reached 20 feet deep. That's the electron mudflow. A study published in the journal Geology in 2026 dated it using tree rings. 21 trees killed by the flow were chromed as dated, and a radiocarbon wiggle match bracketed the event between 1477 and 1522, landing on late summer of 1507 as the most likely date. This is a mountain that buried a forest where a town now stands, and it can be dated to within a season, 519 years ago. Here is the premise this whole story rests on. No geological evidence discovered to date has linked the electron mudflow with eruptive activity. That's USGS's own wording. They call electron an unheralded lahar, because no volcanic unrest is known to have come before it. The mountain didn't WWARN anybody. It just let go. USGS has a specific term for this in their current hazard brochure, published in April, a no-notice lahar. Pierce County describes the same phenomenon from their emergency management side. For non-eruptive events, there may not be any detectable precursors, and warning time could run to minutes or tens of minutes. Here's something you might not have heard framed this way anywhere else. A no-notice lahar is the less likely path. Pierce County counts 9 large lahars off Mount Rainier in the last 500-600 years, and 8 of those 9 were associated with eruptions. 1 in 9 came without warning. USGS puts it in writing. A lahar is almost always preceded by volcanic unrest, so in most instances there will be time to warn people. That's the real picture. Most likely, this mountain will give warning. It'll shake, deform, vent gas. The alert level will climb, and people will have days or weeks to prepare. That's been the pattern 8 times out of 9. But 1 time out of 9, a piece of chemically rotted mountain slid off, and there's a good chance no one knew it was happening until it already had. Which brings us to last summer. On July 8th, 2285, an earthquake swarm started under the summit of Mount Rainier. At its peak, the seismic network was recording 40 events an hour. The background rate at this mountain is roughly 10 events a month. By late August, USGS had located over 350 individual earthquakes. It was the largest swarm ever recorded at this mountain in the entire instrumental record, and yet the alert level never moved. USGS traced the cause to the volcano's hydrothermal system, water moving through the crust above the magma chamber, not magma itself climbing toward the surface. A gas survey found emissions consistent with historical baseline measurements. No unusual ground deformation was detected. Not one of those 350 earthquakes was strong enough to be felt at the surface by anybody. It was hot water shifting through old fractures, lubricating faults that were already there, nothing more. Some channels turned D that swarm into something it plainly was not. As of the USGS Cascades Volcano Observatory update on July the 24th, 2026, Mount Rainier remains at alert level normal, aviation color code green. No unrest. Nothing on that mountain is currently stirring. The story here has never depended on the mountain doing something dramatic this particular year. It's that roughly 90,000 people live where a lahar could reach them, and on the least likely path of that happening, there would be almost no time to react. Let's get that number exactly right, because this is where misinformation online gets its worst. USGS's current figure from May 2024 is that more than 90,000 people live in areas that could be affected by a future large lahar. The number you'll see quoted most often online instead is 2.5 million. That number should not be used the way it usually is. It comes from a Washington State Department of Natural R. E-sources, circular, and the actual sentence behind it says, Rainier's 11 rivers lead to 6 lowland valleys, with a combined population of more than 2.5 million people. That's the total population of 6 entire valley systems, a bro-ad regional total. It is not the number of people sitting inside an actual lahar hazard zone, and presenting it that way is simply inaccurate. 90,000 is the real current figure, and it's serious enough on its own without inflating it. Underneath that 90,000 figure sits 63 schools, 30 child daycare facilities, 19 adult residential care facilities, Interstate 5, and the Port of Tacoma. Pierce County's own hazard assessment states that a lahar has the potential to cause the high guessed number of fatalities and casualties of any hazard they evaluate for the entire county. In their words, most of Puyallup, almost all of Sumner, and all of Orting could be totally destroyed. Which raises the only question that actually matters here. How much warning would those people get? It's worth understanding why this particular set of towns ended up sitting in the path in the first place, because it wasn't an accident of bad luck, so much as a slow accumulation of ordinary decisions made over more than a century. The Puyallup Valley has some of the most productive farmland in the Pacific Northwest, built on exactly the kind of flat, fertile soil that a lahar deposit leaves behind once it settles and weathers over centuries. People settled there for the soil long before anyone had the geological tools to recognize that the soil itself was the fingerprint of a past disaster. Railroads followed the flattest, easiest grades through the valley. Towns grew up around the railroads, and population kept building on top of population for generations, all without anyone connecting the dots between the ground they were standing on and the volcano visible on the horizon above them. It wasn't until the late 20th century, once hydrothermal alteration and lahar dynamics were properly understood by geologists, that USGS and Pierce County could finally look at the valley floor and say plainly, this entire landscape was built by the same kind of event we now need to plan for happening again. There is a detection system, and it went operational back in 1998, built on 1990s equipment. Buried acoustic flow monitors and tripwires running on low bandwidth and low power, meaning data was on, lie transmitted every 2 minutes. Engineers who later reviewed and upgraded the system described the result as at least 4 minutes of delay between a lahar actually passing a sensor and the system reporting that a lahar had passed it. 4 minutes lost out of the roughly 60 a flow takes to reach Orting. That system is being upgraded. Dead right now. 14 new monitoring sites went in between 2017 and 2021, with up to 20 more planned, heading toward more than 40 real-time stations total. USGS attaches one important caveat to all of it, and they mean it seriously. The system reduces, but does not eliminate risk in the lahar pathways. Here's the real timeline in practice, and this is the number that sticks with people once they hear it. According to USGS, if a large lahar were generated in the upper Puyallup River Valley without the precursors that typically signal volcanic unrest, it could arrive at the city of Orting as little as 40 minutes after the initial warning is sounded. 40 minutes after the warning sounds, not after the lahar itself starts moving. Total time from the mountain letting go to the flow reaching Orting is roughly an hour, and detection and notification eat up the first 20 minutes of that hour before anyone even hears a siren. Sumner sits at about 2 hours, Puyallup at 3, Auburn at 5. Higher up the mountain, it's far worse, roughly 10 minutes to reach the Nisqually Park entrance. Notice the actual speed involved here because it matters. USGS's 2021 modeling puts the flow front at roughly 4 meters per second by the time it reaches Orting, which works out to about 9 miles an hour, not the 45 to 50 miles per hour figure mentioned earlier. That higher number applies close to the volcano, inside the tight, confined valleys near the summit. Attaching that speed to Orting would be flatly wrong, and it's a mistake that's been made before. Here's a correction that actually cuts against the scary version of this story, rather than adding to it. In that same USGS simulation, after passing through the Orting lowlands, the lahar slows down and comes to rest in the valleys around Sumner and Puyallup. The worst case, no notice lahar in USGS's own physics model does not reach Puget Sound. It does not flood Tacoma. The scenarios that do reach the sound are the eruption-driven Osceola-class events, and those operate on a completely different scale and a completely different timeline than a no-notice lahar. 40 minutes of real evacuation time is not nothing, but it's also not enough, and Pierce County says so directly. Having a warning system in place does not mean everyone will be able to evacuate the valley bottoms in time. In the upper valley, hey, their own assessment states there could still be many fatalities, and for first responders trying to reach Orting during an active event, their assessment is that doing so will be out of the question, which is exactly why the current USGS brochure carries an instruction in bold worth reading twice. Be prepared to evacuate on foot, not by car. Roads can quickly become clogged during a sudden evacuation. That instruction is the reason those school kids walk every April, and it's also the reason for something happening in Orting right now that's genuinely remarkable. Orting sits in a bend of the valley with the river running between the town and the high ground. So the town is building a bridge, but not for cars. A pedestrian evacuation bridge over State Route 162 running from the Foothills Trail toward Rocky Ridge. It does 2 jobs at once: a walking route for school children on an ordinary day, and an escape route on the worst day possible. Phase 1, CIA. OSTE, roughly $9 million in state funding. Construction started in early 2025, and the city has targeted this summer for completion. A second bridge is planned over the Carbon River, heading up toward Tehalee. You'll see a $40 million figure attached to this project in some places online, but that number belongs to a much larger suspension bridge concept from 2016 that was never actually built. What's actually under construction is the $9 million structure. A town spent $9 million on a footbridge, because the mountain might not give anyone enough time to drive out. Now let's close the loop on Yellowstone, because the comparison in the title deserves a real answer, not a cheap one. USGS puts the yearly odds of another caldera-forming eruption at Yellowstone at roughly 1 in 730,000. And they state plainly there's no evidence one is coming within the next several centuries. Don't let anyone tell. LU Yellowstone is overdue. That claim comes from taking 3 historical eruptions, measuring the 2 gaps between them, averaging that gap, and then treating the result like a bus timetable, which isn't how volcanic recurrence actually works. To be fair to Yellowstone here too, cause overcorrecting is its own kind of distortion. Yellowstone is not rated a low threat. In the 2018 assessment, it landed in the high threat tier, the second of 5 tiers overall, which is a serious ranking on its own. Rainier simply ranks above it. Now, put Rainier next to that number. USGS estimates large lahars reach the Puget Sound lowlands at least once every 500 to 1,000 years, which they translate into roughly a 1 in 10 chance within an average human lifetime. You'll see a 1 in 7 figure F. Tate's 1 in 10 across 2 separate publications, so that's the number to go with. 1 in 730,000 per year for the Yellowstone scenario everyone fears. Roughly 1 in 10 per lifetime for the Rainier scenario almost nobody has heard of. That's the actual comparison, and it didn't require exaggerating a single number to make. USGS says something else that lands harder than any ranking. Mount Rainier has erupted less often and less explosively in recent millennia than Mount St. Helens, but the proximity of large population centers and valleys susceptible to lahars makes it a far greater threat to life and property. A mountain less violent than the one that exploded on live television in 1980, made more dangerous purely by who moved into the valleys below it since. And if you want to know what it looks like when the warning doesn't arrive in time, there's a case USGS itself uses directly, and it's the reason this story needed to be told. On November 13th, 1985, a lahar from Nevado del Ruiz in Colombia reached the town of Armero and Kill. Led more than 23,000 people. Pierce County notes that flow was small compared to some that have come down from Mount Rainier in the past. Mud depths of 6 to 16 feet, roughly 6.5 feet of flowing concrete on average, and 23,000 people dead. USGS captions a photograph of that town with a single line. Tragically, safety lay nearby in areas of higher ground. Here's the practical part. Kept short and real. Because information without a next step just turns into anxiety, and that's not the goal here. If you live in the Puyallup, Carbon, or Nisqually valleys, the most useful thing you can do this week takes about 20 minutes. Find out whether your address sits inside a lahar hazard zone. Pierce County and Washington State both publish the maps publicly. Then find your evacuation route on foot. Walk it once and time it, not drive it, walk it. If you have kids in one of those 5 school district they've probably already walked their route, and they might know it better than you do. So ask them. Learn what the sirens actually sound like and decide right now that you'll move on the first one you hear instead of waiting for confirmation, because in the no-notice scenario, the confirmation is the mud arriving. Agree on a meeting point on high ground with your household, and plan under the assumption that phones won't work and roads will be blocked. And if you don't live anywhere near a volcano, this lesson still applies directly to you. The gap between what the ground can do and what the people living on it have actually prepared for, that gap is why our casualties come from, in any hazard, anywhere. 72 hours of water and food, any medication you depend on, a flashlight, a radio, a first aid kit, copies of your important documents, and one plan that everyone in the house actually knows. It's an afternoon of work, not a lifestyle change. On a clear day, Mount Rainier sits right there on the horizon from Seattle and Tacoma. It's beautiful. People photograph it constantly. About 90,000 of those same people live on ground the mountain has already covered once before. The hazard isn't hidden. It's mapped. It's modeled. My T's wired with sensors right now, being upgraded as we speak. And it's rehearsed every spring by kids walking uphill on an ordinary Thursday morning, because the adults around them decided practicing beats, hoping. $9 million on a footbridge. 5 school districts running drills. A siren network being modernized station by station. That's a community that looked at a 1 in 10 lifetime probability and took it seriously, without waiting for a headline to force the issue. The mountain will do what it does on its own timescale, and nobody, including USGS, can tell you exactly when that will be. What's already decided, right now, today, is how much of that valley knows the way out. And that part was never up to the volcano. One last comparison worth making, because it puts everything above in perspective without needing a single new statistic. Japan lives with active volcanoes across the entire country and has built one of the most sophisticated volcanic monitoring and public warning systems in the world, specifically because the alternative was proven unacceptable generations. Ego. Indonesia, the country that gave lahars their name, evacuates hundreds of thousands of people around Merapi and other volcanoes on a regular basis, treating evacuation drills as routine civic infrastructure rather than something reserved for a crisis. What Orting and Puyallup and some near are doing right now, the drills, the sensor network, the footbridge, is the same basic playbook. Applied at a smaller scale to a mountain most Americans have never thought of as dangerous at all, because it isn't smoking, it isn't rumbling. It just sits there looking scenic on the horizon. That's precisely what makes Rainier a harder sell for preparedness than a V. Volcano that visibly threatens people. And it's exactly why the schools, the county, and USGS keep pushing the message anyway, year after year, without an eruption to point to as justification. The evidence for taking Rainier seriously was never going to come from the volcano doing so. Nothing dramatic on camera. It was always going to come from the ground itself, and the ground has already spoken, twice, 5,600 years apart and 500 years apart, in exactly the valleys where people now live.